The high-pitched whine was still there, not external noise, but a frequency rooted deep in the bone marrow of Jonah Phelan's skull, vibrating her molars loose. Every desperate movement scraped layered ferrosteel against the jagged wreckage pinning her chest and left leg. She tasted blood in the thick metallic air of Kalen Prime, an atmosphere saturated with vaporized coolant and the heavy, sweet scent of alien decay. The Mantis Walker, designated Arbiter 6 Hamau, had imploded inward, its layers of reinforced chassis folding like cheap foil, a final, catastrophic testament to their collective arrogance. The suit had lost the primary plasma conduit in the 5th millisecond of contact, but the sound, that sick, wet buckling of metal, had echoed for several full seconds, drowning out the crackling screams of her squad mates on the open comms channel. Now the comms were silent, replaced only by the residual hum of the enemy's weapon. Jonah reached for the trauma kit, the action slow, agonizing, requiring precision she hadn't needed since she was a field-grade tactical lead. Now she just managed salvage chassis inventory. She was supposed to be 10 kilometers back, running rear guard diagnostics, far from the impact zone. She had warned them, insisted on recalibrating the vibro-steel integrity against predicted high-frequency stress loads. She had been laughed at. Jonah the Cautious. They called her. They had believed in kinetic force. They believed in armor. They sneered at the enemy's lack of technology, calling them the chitinous. No armor. Just bone, they said, dismissing the threat based on archaic visual metrics. The Galactic Compact had forgotten the lessons of history. The most dangerous weapon is the one you refuse to believe exists. That bone, she knew now, was the threat. Denser than any engineered alloy, the chitinous biological structure generated internal stress frequencies that turned the Compact's best shells into powdered dust before impact. The cold fear now gripping Jonah was precise, tactical, a calculated assessment of failure, unlike the panic that had crippled her 3 years ago on Helios Station. She leveraged a broken hydraulic strut, forcing the Mantis wreck upward by millimeters, a wet, sickening tear erupting from her ribs. Pain was just data now, feedback telling her the limit of the physics involved. She ignored the warning lights flashing red across her broken visor. When she finally slid free, the ground tasted like humid iron. She pushed herself up onto her remaining limbs, the high-frequency vibration temporarily worsening, blurring the edges of the steaming jungle foliage. The immediate task was the femur. She located the retrieval cache, a small shielded container meant for biological contaminants, sealed with a biolock keyed to her command codes. Inside, wrapped in thermal foil, was the shard, a piece of chitinous femur, impossibly smooth, charcoal black, and radiating a faint, cold energy that was somehow the absence of all frequency. It felt heavier than the wreckage she had just escaped, a concentrated, tangible mass of impossible density. She secured the shard into her emergency inventory slot, just as her heavily damaged comm crackled back to life. It tore through the sonic residue, sharp and urgent. "Phelan, you there?" The voice was strained, thick with static, belonging to the extraction medic, Callan. "Shuttle Relith inbound, ETA 4 minutes. Overloaded, Jonah. We have Nielsen and Dax. They're critical, but stable enough for transport. Barely." Jonah stared at the shard of alien bone. Priority 1 cargo. Command had been explicit. The Compact needed the analysis of this material to develop even rudimentary countermeasures. Without it, the fleet was blind, and every future encounter would end exactly like Kalen Prime. The Compact's entire tactical pivot hinged on uploading this sample. She knew the protocol by heart. The secure, designated slot for Priority 1 cargo was in the shuttle's medbay, structurally separated to prevent biological contamination, taking up 2 crucial patient slots. The Relith was already over budget with the initial casualty load. To upload the femur into the designated port meant ejecting 2 non-essential priority personnel to make weight in space. Nielsen and Dax. If they were left behind, their death was guaranteed in 20 minutes, precisely when the orbital bombardment commenced to sterilize the contaminated zone. Protecting the future of the entire Compact meant sacrificing 2 real men bleeding out in the mud now. Jonah's past, the lessons learned from Helios, were where she sacrificed immediate lives for the rigid adherence to doctrine, demanded she upload the sample immediately. The greater good. It was a cold, necessary calculation. But the memory of 3 unarmed settlers trapped outside the perimeter, left to die because the schematics demanded retreat, burned away the tactical coldness. She could save the compact, or she could save Nielsen and Dax. The rigid calculation felt like betrayal. She clenched the femur shard in her glove, the sharp edges pressing through the synthetic fabric and into her palm. The weight of it was terrifying. She looked down at the coordinates flashing on her broken HUD. The medbay was 300 meters north, across a contaminated ravine. The shuttle's ascent signature hit the atmosphere, its roar beginning to drown out the insectoid buzz of the jungle. Her training screamed at her to move south, toward the rendezvous point and the immediate upload port. But something deeper, a layer of identity she had buried since her demotion, had awakened. It was the part of her that understood the failure of doctrine, the necessity of bending the rules that had already proven fatal. Jonah didn't move toward the sample port. Instead, she adjusted her tattered filtration mask and started moving north, ignoring the feedback scream from her damaged comm unit. She reached out with her ruined hand, her fingers flying across the auxiliary controls, and whispered a sequence of frequency-scrambled override codes. It was a Black Ops cleanup frequency, a relic from the tactical lead she used to be. A code that bypassed standard military logistics channels entirely, creating a momentary, undetectable window. She was not just heading toward the wounded. She was buying time. Time to find a third option that Command had deemed impossible. The kind of impossible that only happens when someone stops prioritizing the schema over the scream. She transmitted a single, short burst toward Callan's heavily scrambled frequency. Delay secondary upload. I have the bone. Preparing alternate route. She paused for a second, feeling the impossible weight of the femur in her hand. It was proof that the chitinous were not primitives. It was proof that the war had been fundamentally misunderstood. And then, she moved. The first few steps were heavy, labored, but then her gait smoothed out, the precision of a trained operator taking over the pain. The technician had disappeared. Only the soldier who had known command and understood the true cost of failure remained. As she entered the dense, steaming jungle canopy, Jonah realized the true horror. They had all laughed at the Kitness's lack of armor, but her own steel had shattered, and she was only just now learning how to fight with bone. The jungle swallowed the initial roar of the incoming extraction shuttle. The air grew immediately heavier, the humidity pressing like a damp blanket. Jonah moved with the practiced, uneven rhythm of someone compensating for cracked ribs and a failing chassis. Every twist of her torso ignited a spike of white-hot pain, but she focused on the internal timer flashing erratically on her HUD, 16 minutes remaining until orbital sterilization. Her decision, the deliberate detour toward Nielsen and Dax, was not tactical brilliance. It was a rejection. A defiant flinch against the cold, calculated logic that had previously consumed her. On Helios Station, adherence to the retreat schematic had cost 3 civilian lives. Jonah had survived that inquiry, but the memory, the quiet panic in the eyes of the young mother she left outside the perimeter, had hollowed her out, leaving only the shell of a logistics officer. Now, faced with the same binary choice, she chose the immediate, bloody warmth of humanity over the sterile, necessary geometry of the greater good. The ravine dividing her from the medbay was not natural. It was a gash in the earth, 50 meters wide, where the Mantis Walker's power core had finally vented, cauterizing the ground. The edges steamed, and a deep, humming radiation warned her suit's damaged environmental sensors. Standard procedure required a wide detour, at least 2 kilometers, to avoid thermal stress failure. Jonah looked at her chrono. She had 3 minutes before Callan would be forced to proceed with the landing protocol, and Callan was trained to obey Priority 1 directives. Jonah had to cross. She found a narrow, scorched bridge of unstable ferrocrete, a collapsed landing strut from another destroyed vehicle. The structure groaned, spitting sparks as she placed her damaged weight upon it. The air was sulfurous here, tasting like burnt circuitry and ozone. She moved slowly, the femur shard still secured in her glove, its unnatural density a constant cold presence against her palm. Delay secondary upload. Preparing alternate route. The transmission was an act of insubordination, buying perhaps 90 seconds of confusion. It relied entirely on Callan's residual loyalty to the tactical lead Jonah used to be. Halfway across the strut, the ground shuddered, not from the shuttle but from something deeper. A guttural, rhythmic sound began to approach from the south, the main combat zone. A voice, sharp and digital, sliced through the static on the open command channel. It was Vice Admiral Toran, Jonah's direct superior, the man who oversaw the salvage operations and had personally signed off on her demotion 3 years prior. Toran did not sound panicked. He sounded impatient. Phelan, report immediate status. Callan advises of a non-standard maneuver. Are you within the designated upload zone, or are you still attempting field recovery of non-essential personnel? Jonah froze on the unstable strut. Toran's voice was the embodiment of the rigid doctrine she was currently rejecting. It was the law of the schematic, the cruel mathematics of command. Sir, I am securing P1 cargo, Jonah transmitted, injecting a false calm into her voice, deliberately omitting the fact that she was 300 meters north of the required location. Attempting alternative upload vector due to localized radiation spike at main port. Negative, Phelan. The data shows minimal thermal interference. You are moving off-grid. Return to designated coordinates. The lives of 2 minor casualties do not supersede the strategic analysis of the chitinous threat. Helios protocols apply here, Lieutenant. The mention of Helios was a deliberate cut. Toran wasn't just giving an order. He was invoking Jonah's greatest failure, using her guilt as a leash. The 3 settlers, Lieutenant Phelan. Their deaths were tragic, but necessary for tactical cohesion. That was the official verdict. Jonah felt a sick flush of heat beneath her suit, not from the ravine, but from memory. On Helios, she had been paralyzed by the conflicting screams, the settlers' immediate panic versus the protocol's absolute demand for retreat. She had chosen the rule. She had lost command, and they had lost their lives. The shame of that paralysis was the bone in her throat. She took a breath, the air whistling through the broken filters of her mask, tasting the iron decay of Kaelin Prime. The weight of the femur in her hand felt like a counter-argument to every calculation Toran had ever made. Understood, Admiral, she said, her voice flat, emotionless. Diverting back to main port immediately. She lied, then immediately deactivated her primary comms array, cutting Toran off. The sudden silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the damaged strut beneath her feet and the approaching rhythmic sound from the south. The sound, she realized, was chitinous legs, heavy and numerous, moving fast across the jungle floor. The cleanup crew had arrived. The strut groaned and shattered. Jonah dropped, a controlled fall into the edge of the ravine, catching herself on a twisted metal shard, barely avoiding the superheated vapor. The impact jolted her ribs, and a sharp metallic tang of blood filled her mouth. She pushed herself up, staggering onto solid ground on the northern side of the ravine. She was clear, but the delay had cost her precious time. The extraction shuttle, Relith, was already in low orbit, beginning its deceleration burn. 300 meters north, through the dense, steaming alien flora, she saw the makeshift medbay lit by sputtering emergency flares. It was a flimsy tent anchored to a downed transport vehicle. Callan, the medic, was a blur of frantic movement, loading critical gear onto 2 stretchers. Nielsen and Dax were stabilized, but wrapped tight in thermal blankets, tubes leading from their bodies to portable life support. Callan saw Jonah emerge from the foliage, her ruined suit steaming, the shadow of the Mantis Walker's demise still coating her chassis. Jonah? I tried to tell them. Toran is locked on the Priority 1 upload. If we don't get that bone into the secure cradle now. Callan's voice trailed off, fear tightening his features. Jonah held up the femur shard. We are not uploading it to the cradle. Callan looked bewildered. What? Jonah, we have 2 minutes before Relith reaches the hard limit for medbay capacity. Torin authorized the displacement of Nielsen and Dax if the P1 sample wasn't secured first. We have to secure the bone. We secure the bone and the men, Jonah countered, moving past Callan and directly toward the medbay tent. She ignored the pain, focusing on the equipment. The designated slot is designed for structural separation. It's physically reinforced to survive high-frequency oscillation during transit. It's meant to hold the sample away from organic matter. Yes, that's the point of the P1 protocol, containment. No, Jonah snapped, her voice low and tense as she assessed the life support unit attached to Nielsen. Containment is secondary. Structural integrity is primary. They designed that cradle to protect the bone, Callan, not just from biological contaminants, but from its own natural frequency signature. She pointed to the charcoal black femur shard in her hand. This material generates localized stress waves that cause structural failure. That's how they beat us. The cradle is shielding the compact from the artifact itself. That density is the key to understanding their defense. Jonah looked at the small, portable bioscanner Callan was packing. Does that scanner have a high-frequency spectrum analyzer? Yes, but it's low-power field grade. It's barely capable of reading basic cell structure. It's enough. Jonah took the scanner. Her plan, half-formed and desperate, was to force the crucial data onto the compact network before the shuttle arrived, rendering the physical sample redundant. It was the only way to save Nielsen and Dax without abandoning the fleet's intelligence needs. We override the security cradle protocol, Jonah explained, her fingers flying over the scanner's ancient keypad, using a series of technician bypasses she had mastered during her demotion. We run a fast spectral scan on the bone's internal frequency, compress the data, and upload it through the Relith's secondary comms burst before we land. If the data is received, the physical sample becomes non-essential, and the medbay slots remain allocated to the wounded. Callan's eyes widened, recognizing the magnitude of the maneuver. That's bypassing command, Jonah. That's a court-martial offense, if the data upload fails. If the data upload fails, the fleet dies anyway, Jonah stated, slamming the bone shard onto the scanner's reading plate. At least here, we save these two. The low-power scanner immediately overloaded. The small screen flared blue, then went dark. A thin stream of acrid smoke rose from the input port. Jonah stared at the burnt device. Her first attempt, relying on her technical competence from her demotion, had failed. The bone's unique material density, the very thing they needed to analyze, had fried their only field instrument. The problem was not just political or moral, it was exponentially technical. The chitinous defense mechanism was inherently destructive to their analytical tools. The rhythmic thrumming from the south was much closer now, sounding like gigantic hammers striking dried earth. Jonah, we are out of time. Relith is initiating final descent sequence. The designated upload port is ready, Callan urged, his voice frantic. Torin is going to order the stretchers jettisoned the moment you confirm visual with the ship. We have to make the trade. Jonah looked at the scanner, then at the impossibly dense bone, then at Dax, whose chest rose and fell in shallow, painful gasps beneath the thermal blanket. She thought of Helios again, of the rigid, fatal calculation she had made then. She would not make that mistake twice. The greater good, she realized, was only good if you could look the immediate cost in the eye. We aren't making the trade, Jonah said firmly, ripping the femoral shard from the ruined scanner plate. She moved quickly, looking for alternatives, her eyes fixed on the remaining functional life support units connected to the wounded. Standard compact issue. Each unit had a heavily shielded diagnostic telemetry port, a deep storage, heavily reinforced for continuous field use. It was designed to transmit vital signs data to a receiving hospital and survive environmental stress. Callan, how durable is the telemetry housing on these life support units? Jonah asked, already examining the port on Nielsen's unit. Industrial grade. Why? If we can't scan the density, we transport the bone inside, the only material guaranteed to survive the transit frequency, Jonah muttered, her mind racing, connecting dots that only a salvaged chassis technician could see. The Priority 1 cradle was essentially a miniature reinforced vault, The life support telemetry port was a miniature, reinforced safe. She tore open the port cover. The cavity was tight, filled with microcircuitry and dampening gel. If I compress the bone into the port, it will destroy the unit's functionality, and Nielsen dies instantly if we can't secure external life support, Jonah said, the tactical calculation returning, but this time focused on saving only one life, Dax, by potentially sacrificing the other, Nielsen, to save the greater fleet. But Callan, sensing her shift, intervened, his voice hoarse. Don't. Dax is worse. Nielsen has the better chance of survival, even with a temporary interruption. Jonah stopped. She stared at Callan, recognizing the impossible cold precision of a medic's field triage. She respected it. We have to split the difference, Callan. One of them buys the fleet the information. The other lives, Jonah whispered. Just then, the shuttle Relith dropped into view above the canopy, the downdraft stirring up dust and debris. The open comms channel crackled to life, Torin's voice overriding the automatic landing beacon. Callan, report on P1 cargo acquisition. We are landing now. Upload must commence on approach. Jonah made the choice. She ripped the secondary power supply from Dax's life support, then jammed the charcoal black femur shard into the reinforced telemetry port on Nielsen's unit, forcing the dense bone deep into the shielded casing. The unit screamed electrically, then went silent. Dax's remaining life support systems flickered, starved of power. Jonah had traded one life's dependency for the fleet's intelligence need and simultaneously endangered the other. The bone is secured, Jonah transmitted, loud and clear, bypassing Callan's frequency. Inside a secondary reinforced containment unit, preparing to transport both patients. Torin's response was immediate and furious. Phelan, that unit is not designated P1 compatible. You have contaminated critical medbay telemetry. Stand down and revert to protocol, or I will authorize orbital asset denial. Orbital asset denial meant the Relith would abort landing, and the bombardment would commence in 15 minutes. The unit's structural integrity is sufficient, Admiral, Jonah lied, her eyes scanning the darkening jungle line. The data is already transmitting on an emergency burst frequency, encrypted, non-standard. The compact is about to receive an analysis of the chitinous defense mechanism far beyond what the P1 cradle could provide. Jonah knew the lie would cost her everything, but the fear in Torin's voice, the fear that she might be right, that she might have found an answer in the wreckage he dismissed, was satisfying. Callan was already lifting Dax's remaining flickering life support. We have to move now. They're here. The rhythmic thrumming exploded into the sounds of snapping timber and tearing synthetic foliage. The chitinous were emerging from the jungle. They were not 2 kilometers away. They were 50 meters away, and they were fast. Jonah felt the impossible weight of her choice, the silence of Nielsen's unit now guaranteeing the fleet's future, the shallow breaths of Dax relying on stolen time. She grabbed Nielsen's stretcher. Move! She yelled, stumbling out of the medbay tent and into the light of the landing shuttle. The creature that stepped into the firelight of the clearing was not a primitive, armored insect. It was massive, black, and its segmented legs ended not in claws, but in dense engineered bone formations that glowed faintly, resonating with the very high-frequency stress that shattered steel. But Jonah Phelan noticed one thing that Command had missed in their arrogance. This creature, impossibly dense and indestructible, was also carrying something. Not a weapon, but a burden. A smaller wounded chitinous, secured carefully to its back. They were not fighting a weapon system, Jonah realized with a chill that exceeded the humid night air. They were fighting a civilization. And as the creature turned its impossibly dense head, revealing eyes that reflected intelligence and ancient hatred, Jonah realized the data they needed, the real data, was not the density of the bone. It was the cost of the burden. The orbital bombardment window narrowed to 13 minutes. She heard Torin's voice, a final cold transmission before the jamming began. Phelan, you have made your choice. You are now classified as non-essential personnel. The orbital strike is proceeding on schedule. You have exactly 12 minutes to clear the perimeter. Jonah's choice was no longer just about logistics. It was a physical weight, heavier than the Mantis wreckage, a consequence that immediately bore fruit. The instant she confirmed the secured status of the P-1 cargo, the bone jammed into Nielsen's life support telemetry. The Relith's automated landing protocols were overridden by the furious frequency modulation of Admiral Toran. The large, heavy shuttle did not glide. It dropped, engines roaring in a panicked deceleration burn, churning the humid air into a thick, choking dust cloud of pulverized foliage and metallic residue. Emergency hover extract. Phelan, get the goddamn unit secured. We are under kinetic pressure. The pilot, voice tinny with stress, screamed over the open comms. The downdraft was so severe it threatened to tear the flimsy medbay tent from its moorings. Callan was already wrestling with Dax's stretcher, dragging the wounded man toward the unstable landing area. Nielsen's unit, silent now, was heavier than before, the charcoal black femur shard adding impossible density to the reinforced housing. Jonah grabbed Nielsen's stretcher handles, ignoring the stabbing pain in her ribs as she pulled. She moved with the awkward, low gait of a beast of burden, focused only on the final critical step, stabilizing the telemetry antenna on Nielsen's unit long enough to force the compressed data burst. The chitinous warrior, the one carrying its own wounded, stepped fully into the clearing. It didn't rush. It moved with the calculated, heavy precision of an apex predator. It generated a low, persistent hum, a vibration Jonah felt deep in her dental fillings, a clear indication it was preparing a targeted high-frequency stress wave attack. "Callan, cover! Keep Dax moving!" Jonah yelled, dropping to one knee beside Nielsen's stretcher. She ripped the cover off the telemetry antenna array, her fingers moving with the technician's frantic competence she had cultivated during her demotion. She needed a clear line to the Relith's secondary comms receiver, shielded against the downdraft and the enemy's sonic interference. She stabilized the antenna's joint, forcing the connection. Transmit, encrypt, burst. The antenna flared with a weak, blue electric discharge. Jonah felt the recoil immediately, not physical, but biological. The intense density of the bone, designed to shatter external frequencies, was equally hostile to internal data transmission. It was a perfect, self-contained defense mechanism. The screen on her ruined gauntlet flickered red. Transmission failed. Internal system overload. Worse, the spike of chaotic energy from the failure raced through the external power cables connecting Nielsen and Dax. Dax's remaining life support systems, already starved of power, screamed an audible alarm, then died completely. The flickering lights on Dax's chest unit went dark. Jonah's chest seized. She had made a rigid, tactical choice based on engineering, sacrificing Nielsen's functionality for the greater good, and in 3 seconds, she had jeopardized Dax's life entirely, gaining nothing for the fleet. De mal en pire. From bad to worse. The old Terran expression her father used to use felt like the final law of this cursed planet. The chitinous warrior raised one of its massive forelimbs, generating a focused, high-pitched shriek. The sound didn't hurt Jonah's chassis. It was aimed lower. The sonic frequency detonated the remaining emergency flares. The small clearing plunged into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the unstable red navigation lights of the hovering Relith. The chitinous had gained the darkness. Jonah was now under physical and temporal pressure. 10 minutes remaining until orbital sterilization. "Dax is crashing, Jonah. I need light. I need stable power." Callan's voice was strained, thick with panic and the dust. Jonah threw off the heavy Mantis gauntlet and forced herself to focus, relying on her suit's damaged night vision filter, which rendered the world in sickly, low-resolution greens. She couldn't send the data wirelessly. The bone itself prevented it. She needed a hardline connection, a stable, direct feed into the Relith's secure network port, which was usually only accessible when the ship was grounded and sealed. The Relith was hovering precariously, maybe 3 meters above the churning dust. Its cargo ramp was barely touching the ground, vibrating wildly. "Callan, you have to stabilize Dax with a manual pump. I'm forcing the hardline," Jonah ordered. She grabbed the telemetry unit cable attached to Nielsen, ripping it free. It was a heavily insulated industrial-grade cable, thick as her wrist. The chitinous moved. It was a blur of impossibly dense shadows closing the distance instantly. Callan fired his sidearm, standard compact kinetic rounds, useless against the chitinous' bone defense. The creature didn't even flinch. It merely swung its forelimb, not toward Callan, but toward the closest source of life support, Dax's stretcher. Callan screamed, a sound that cut through the engine noise. The blow wasn't lethal, but it caught the medic hard on the shoulder, sending him spinning into the hull of the Relith with a sickening crunch. Callan collapsed, his weapon skittering away into the dark. He was alive, breathing in shallow gasps, but neutralized. Jonah was now alone, facing a warrior the Compact had declared impossible, responsible for securing 2 dying men and the only intelligence that could save the fleet. She saw the chitinous momentarily distracted, turning its dense, black head toward the source of its own wounded companion's muffled complaint. Now. She hoisted Nielsen's stretcher. The weight, combined with the extreme torque on her broken ribs, was crippling. A hot, liquid tearing sensation erupted across her left side. She ignored it, stumbling forward, her vision blurring, the green of the night vision turning to static around the edges. This was the exact cost of her previous failure on Helios, she realized. The self-serving decision to play by the rules then had left her broken now, physically incapable of carrying the burden of her newfound morality. She reached the unstable cargo ramp. She needed to push Nielsen up, then connect the cable. She pushed with the last of her strength. The stretcher rolled 3 feet and stopped, snagging on a broken piece of ramp grating. Jonah lunged to free it. Her sudden violent movement jarred the telemetry unit containing the bone. A loud click echoed from Nielsen's unit. It was the internal emergency failsafe, designed to prevent external contamination if the unit suffered catastrophic trauma. The port sealed permanently, retracting the hardline cable connector into the housing, trapping the P-1 cargo inside a reinforced, inert shell. Attempt 2. Failure. Catastrophic. Not only had she failed to transmit the data, but the bone, the only hope for the fleet, was now inaccessible, locked inside a dead piece of equipment that weighed nearly 200 kilos. The rhythmic thrumming of the chitinous' segmented legs stopped right behind her. The timer on her HUD glowed red. 9 minutes. The cargo ramp, which had been vibrating on the ground, suddenly rose slightly, hovering maybe a meter above the mud. A figure descended, sliding down the ramp from the shuttle's main cabin, heavily armed and wearing the distinct, clean armor of a Relith-class pilot. It was Lieutenant Kyle, the shuttle's chief operator, his face pale and etched with fear. "Phelan, hold position." "I said hold position," Kyle shouted over the engine noise, leveling a compact shock rifle at Jonah. His weapon was set to non-lethal compliance, but at this range, it could still stop her heart. This was the complication. Kale was Torrens' contingency plan. "The ramp won't take them, Lieutenant. You are over capacity. Protocol dictates immediate jettison of non-essential weight. Stand away from the casualty stretchers." Jonah stood between Kyle, the stretchers, Dax dying, Nielsen a bone container, and the colossal shadow of the chitinous warrior. "I have the P-1 cargo secured, Kale. It's in the telemetry unit," Jonah reported, pointing at the dead stretcher. "The men are wounded. Get them inside. I need the hardline access point now." Kyle ignored the threat behind her, his eyes fixed on the inert stretcher. "That unit is contaminated. That wasn't the designated cradle. Torrens' orders are absolute. If the P-1 sample cannot be retrieved through the secure cradle, we are to ensure no competing intelligence leaves the field. The Admiral needs the physical material to reverse engineer our own armor, Phelan, not your fragmented low-power frequency burst." The philosophical depth of the injustice hit Jonah harder than any kinetic blow. Torren didn't want the data to defend the fleet. He wanted the raw material to profit from the war, leveraging the deaths of Kalen Prime to build better, costlier equipment for future battles. The lives of Nielsen and Dax were meaningless against the promise of a superior vibrosteel alloy. Jonah stared at Kale, then at the chitinous warrior, who was now slowly circling, recognizing the standoff. "Listen to me, Kale. The orbital strike is in less than 9 minutes. Turan is bluffing about the asset denial. He wants to wipe the evidence, not save the fleet," Jonah insisted, trying to appeal to the terrified man's sense of duty. "Torin pays my pension, Phelan," Kale snapped, his finger tightening on the trigger. "And he promised a triple bonus if I secured the artifact intact. Move." Jonah had 2 seconds to process the dilemma. Fight Kale, the compact officer, and likely die to his shock rifle while the chitinous waited patiently to reclaim its lost biological material. Or abandon the fight, sacrifice Nielsen and the bone, and the men, and attempt to board the Relith to manually abort the orbital strike from the cockpit. She could not fight Kale, she was too compromised physically. She could not abandon the wounded. Jonah made the cold calculation she had failed to make at Helios. Immediate, minimal violence to achieve the larger goal. She kicked Nielsen's stretcher hard, propelling the heavy unit and the locked bone directly toward the massive legs of the chitinous warrior. The creature instinctively responded, bringing a forelimb down to crush the metallic object that had just assaulted it. The impact produced a shockwave that threw Jonah backward into the dust. In that millisecond of distraction, Jonah charged Kale, not to fight, but to push. She drove her shoulder into the pilot's chest plate. Kale stumbled, losing his footing on the ramp. "Callan! Dax! Now!" Jonah screamed. Callan, nursing his broken shoulder, used his remaining good arm to haul Dax's stretcher onto the half-open ramp. Jonah, leveraging the momentary confusion, gave the ramp a final, desperate shove. Callan and Dax slid into the cabin, but Kale recovered instantly, his terror replaced by rage. He brought the shock rifle up and fired, not at Jonah, but at the Relith's open cargo ramp controls. The blast fried the hydraulic system. With a grinding metallic howl, the ramp snapped shut, sealing Callan and Dax inside. Jonah was left outside, 3 meters from the sealed hull, facing Lieutenant Kyle, who stood now on the closed ramp, rifle pointed at her head. "You chose wrong, Phelan. You chose the casualties over the compact," Kale hissed. Before Jonah could respond, the chitinous warrior, now standing over the ruined telemetry unit that contained its femur, let out a noise that was not a shriek, but a low, vibrating roar of true ancient fury. Its dense, segmented legs clamped down on the Relith's nearest landing strut. The high-frequency energy generated by the creature's bone density was focused, sharp, and overwhelming. The vibro-steel strut, the structural foundation of the extraction shuttle, buckled inward, shattering like glass. The Relith lurched violently, engines screaming as the pilot tried to compensate for the sudden catastrophic loss of stability. Kale, unprepared for the structural failure, lost his balance and fell, sliding down the scarred hull and tumbling into the darkness of the clearing. Jonah watched the ruined strut tear away from the shuttle. The Relith staggered, listing heavily, attempting a panicked vertical ascent. It was crippled, barely held aloft by emergency stabilizers, its cargo ramp sealed, and its landing gear destroyed. It had secured Dax and Callan, but it had abandoned Jonah and the crucial P-1 cargo. The chitinous warrior turned its massive, black head toward Jonah, its intelligent eyes burning with hatred. The wounded creature on its back whimpered. Jonah Phelan stood alone in the dark, her suit systems flashing critical, her chest agony, the enemy a meter away, and the ruined shuttle carrying the only potential witnesses disappearing into the dense clouds above. Her comms crackled one final time, the voice not Toran's, but Kale's, thick with panic and pain from the ground nearby. "Phelan, they're here. They're everywhere. The whole damn cleanup crew. We're overrun." The orbital strike timer showed exactly 8 minutes. Jonah was trapped between an enemy she couldn't kill and a former ally she couldn't trust, with no way to abort the impending genocide. She had saved the men, but she had lost the intelligence, her support, and her only way out. This was the empty void she had feared since Helios, and this time, the schematic offered no comfort. The void Jonah had feared was no longer an abstraction of failure. It was the suffocating iron-rich air of Callan Prime, thick with the silence that followed the Relith's crippled ascent. She was alone in the clearing, 7 minutes remaining until orbital sterilization. The chitinous warrior stood over the pulverized telemetry unit, its dense forelimb resting on the twisted metal that contained its biological material. Jonah felt the rhythmic thrumming of its approach, a sound that bypassed her ears and resonated directly against her shattered ribs. She braced herself, instinctively searching the wreckage for a weapon, any weapon, knowing the shock rifle and the standard kinetic rounds were useless. She needed something that generated localized, focused heat, plasma, maybe, or a detonator. But the chitinous warrior did not attack. It stopped, its massive head lowered, observing her with those intelligent, terrible eyes. It then made a sound Jonah had never heard before. A low, complex frequency that registered not as a threat, but as communication, translated by her damaged suit's universal filter into a rapid mechanical series of clicking whispers. Your metal is broken. Your purpose is severed. Why do you remain? Jonah froze. Universal translators often struggled with non-standard biological communication, usually defaulting to phonetic guesses or generic warnings. This was different. This was precise, almost grammatical. You speak compact basic? Jonah transmitted, the sound hoarse in her broken mask. The bones speak. We listen. The creature resonated. It gestured with a secondary limb toward the crushed life support unit, then back toward the jungle line where Lieutenant Kale was still struggling, whimpering in the dust. You betrayed your own, but you saved the wounded. Inconsistent. We demand clarity. The emotional complexity in the creature's translated resonance, a mix of ancient patience and scientific curiosity, shattered Jonah's understanding of the conflict. The compact had classified the chitinous as primitives, guided only by instinct and density. They were fighting sentient, communicative beings. The chitinous on the warrior's back, the smaller, wounded one, stirred. It let out a soft, high-pitched chirp. The larger warrior paused, its focused intensity shifting to protectiveness. Jonah saw the truth Torin had dismissed. The chitinous valued life, especially their vulnerable. The material you seek is locked inside the metal, Jonah transmitted, her voice steady despite the seismic shift in her reality. It cannot be used by my kind. It can only be studied to improve our weapons. We know. The warrior resonated, its head tilting slightly. That piece is designated. It carries the signature of the silence. We allowed its capture. Jonah felt a cold wave wash over her. Allowed its capture. This was not a sample retrieved from a random kill. It was a deliberate offering. Why? Jonah demanded. The chitinous moved a massive leg, crushing the telemetry unit further, bending the ferro steel into a flat sheet. It stopped just before pulverizing the internal bone shard. The bone contains the frequency of the silence, the ultimate defense. Your command believes this density is the weapon. It is not. It is the cost. The density is biological shielding against the true enemy. Jonah's vision blurred as she processed the implication. The chitinous weren't using the bone to attack the compact. They were using it to defend against something else entirely. Something so devastating they had to evolve into walking fortresses. Against what enemy? The warrior pointed, not with its limb, but with a sudden focus of its internal sonic signature, which Jonah felt as a directional pressure spike against her faceplate. It pointed toward the stars, toward the orbital track where the compact fleet was currently positioned. Your weapon, the Skywomb, the thing that burns worlds and silences the consciousness of all who live on them. Your orbital bombardment. The truth, the central devastating core of the entire war, hit Jonah with the force of 1,000 mantis walkers imploding. The chitinous hadn't shattered their steel. The chitinous had been protecting themselves from the compact's weapons, and the resulting sonic interference had incidentally destroyed the compact's unarmored structures. The war was not one of aggression, but a catastrophic misunderstanding based on the arrogant dismissal of an alien defense mechanism. The Relith was carrying 2 wounded men, but also the data needed to understand the chitinous defense. And in 3 minutes, that same compact fleet was going to sterilize Kalen Prime, erasing the Chitinous and the only evidence that proved the compact was the aggressor. Jonah was now trapped in an impossible dilemma, a moral geometry of cosmic scale. Option A. Trust the Chitinous. She could align with the sentient warrior, perhaps help it retrieve the bone sample, and utilize its unique frequency signature to send a massive localized counter-frequency blast, hoping it would temporarily jam the orbital bombardment systems. This risked trusting an enemy that had just killed her squad, but it was the only way to save the planet and expose the compact's ultimate act of hubris. Cost: immediate execution by the compact, loss of all human identity, and the near certainty of dying on Kalen Prime, but potentially saving billions of Chitinous lives across the planet. Option B. Board the crippled Relith. She could fight her way past Kale, attempt to reach the cockpit, and manually input the abort code for the orbital strike, relying on the slim hope that Callan and Dax were now allies. This meant abandoning the Chitinous warrior and the bone, ensuring the compact would continue the war with blind arrogance, but it offered a marginal chance of survival and exposure of Toran's orders. Cost: the strike might still proceed due to fleet redundancy, the Relith might crash due to damage, and she would have to kill a compact officer, Kale, to gain access. Jonah's chest felt hollowed out, the pain from her fractured ribs now merely a background hum to the moral agony. She looked at the Chitinous warrior, then at the frantic movements of Kale on the ground, struggling to stand. Kale, motivated by a bonus, was the living embodiment of the greed that fueled the compact's violence. The warrior, protecting its wounded, was the symbol of the civilization they were about to erase. You chose wrong, Phelan. You chose the casualties over the compact. Kale's hiss echoed in her memory. Jonah realized her failure on Helios wasn't in choosing protocol over lives, but in believing that the protocol had lives in mind. Toran's adherence to the greater good was just a cover for military profit. The tactical officer in Jonah was dead. What remained was the salvage technician who understood material failure, and the traumatized woman who understood the price of silence. I need access to the core frequency of the bone, Jonah transmitted to the Chitinous warrior, her voice tight with desperation and decision. I cannot transmit data. I must overload the signal at the source. It is the only way to jam the orbital strike. You wish to silence the Skywomb? The warrior asked. That requires full energy transfer. It is immediate death for the host structure. It is the ultimate sacrifice. I understand sacrifice, Jonah said, moving toward the pulverized telemetry unit. The Chitinous warrior moved a forelimb, clearing the twisted metal. The charcoal black femur shard lay exposed, vibrating gently on the mud. It radiated cold energy, a pure field of impossible density. I need that. Now, Jonah stated. The warrior hesitated for only a fraction of a second. It then offered the dense bone shard to Jonah, placing it carefully on the ground between them. It was a gesture of trust, a transference of burden. Jonah reached out with her ruined, ungloved hand. The bone was instantly cold, unnaturally heavy, the absence of frequency pressing against her nerves. As her fingers closed around the shard, she realized the physical connection was allowing her suit's damaged sensors to process a massive, instantaneous data dump. The frequency signature of the silence poured into her mind, not as data points, but as pure, overwhelming experience. She saw fragmented images, vast crystalline cities on Kalen Prime, millions of Chitinous going about their complex, civilized lives. Then, the compact fleet arriving, the first orbital plasma strike vaporizing continents, and the Chitinous immediately evolving their bone structures to create a species-wide shield. They were survivors, not aggressors. The trauma of the Chitinous poured into Jonah, and with it, a final horrifying truth. The density was not just a shield against kinetic impact. It was a shield against a specific compact neurofrequency weapon designed to cause targeted, species-specific mass psychosis before orbital sterilization. The compact didn't just want the Chitinous dead. They wanted them to go insane first. Jonah gagged, leaning on the ruined stretcher for support, the femur shard vibrating violently in her grip. The compact was not merely fighting for profit. They were conducting an engineered genocide masked as defense. She had made her choice. She had abandoned the Relith and the hope of escape. She was allied with the very enemy she had been sent to destroy, to prevent a slaughter orchestrated by her own command. Jonah stood up, the bone shard clutched tight. Her objective was no longer to abort the strike, but to destroy the compact's orbital capability. She needed a power source massive enough to resonate the chitinous frequency through the atmosphere, a focused electromagnetic pulse that would temporarily blind the entire fleet and expose Toran. She looked around the clearing, illuminated only by the faint residual navigation lights of the fleeing Relith. The only source of massive, unfocused energy remaining was the ruined Mantis Walker, Arbiter 6, pinned 100 meters away. Its primary reactor core was unstable, shielded only by the wreckage. It was a guaranteed detonation, a final, beautiful act of industrial suicide. The chitinous warrior resonated a warning. The sky womb strikes in 5 minutes. You cannot reach the core in time. Jonah knew the warrior was right. She was too slow, too wounded. She couldn't drag herself and the heavy bone artifact 100 meters across the contaminated ground, climb the wreckage, and jury-rig a frequency amplifier onto the core before the bombardment commenced. Jonah looked at her hand, the bone shard pressing against her palm, its impossible density a constant cold pressure. She looked at her suit, the ruined chassis, the broken leg strut, the hydraulic fluid leaking onto the mud. Jonah Phelan had been demoted for incompetence, for being too careful, for saving 3 non-combatants' lives via procedural breach. She was the one who managed salvaged chassis. She understood how dead things could still be used. She dropped the femur shard onto the ground. She took 3 painful, staggering steps toward the warrior, then spun, kicking off the ground and launching herself toward the prone, whimpering Lieutenant Kale. Kale saw her coming, his face a mask of terror. "Stay back, Phelan. Toran will know." Jonah ignored him. She dropped onto the pilot, ripping the still functional comms unit from his wrist before he could fight back. Kale screamed, not from pain, but from the sudden, terrifying exposure to the elements and the nearby enemy. The chitinous warrior watched, impassive, understanding the deeper violence. Jonah crawled back to the bone shard. She jammed the femur deep into the comms unit's transmission port, using Kale's clean, high-grade hardware as the final amplifier. She had no time for precise calculation. She was relying on the Mantis core detonation being close enough to carry the frequency. She looked at the warrior. "The Mantis core. Detonate it now. Use your frequency. I've given you the amplifier. Now, destroy the evidence of the slaughter." The warrior understood. It raised its massive forelimbs, focusing its internal energy. The air around the creature vibrated violently, the sound a building scream that promised structural collapse. But the price of her decision was immediate. Kale, realizing what Jonah intended, the destruction of the Mantis core, the elimination of all potential salvage material, let out a guttural roar of pure economic terror. He lunged at her, not with a weapon, but with his body, tackling Jonah hard. The impact drove the fragile comms unit into the mud, separating the bone shard from the amplifier, destroying the improvised focus system. The Mantis core, 100 meters away, detonated only seconds later, a brilliant, blinding white flare of pure thermal energy as the chitinous warrior finished its frequency attack. The resulting shockwave slammed Jonah into the mud, deafening her, filling her suit with hot dust. The EMP was chaotic, unfocused, a general interference, not the targeted frequency blast needed to disable the orbital strike. Jonah Phelan lay stunned, staring through the static-filled green of her visor, watching the unfocused pillar of light rising from the Mantis wreckage. She had failed. The detonation had occurred, but the critical frequency had not been amplified correctly. The chitinous warrior resonated one last mournful message, a sound of profound disappointment mixed with the finality of tactical defeat. Your species chooses noise over bone. The sky womb is active. Jonah's comms crackled back to life, the static briefly parting to reveal the cold digital voice of Vice Admiral Toran, triumphant and distant. "Phelan, we received your final transmission. Your low-power EMP confirmed high kinetic instability on the planet's surface. Strike confirmed. Enjoy the show, Lieutenant." You always were too sentimental for the greater good. The orbital strike timer flashed. 2 minutes. Jonah had sacrificed the intelligence, saved 2 men, abandoned all hope of rescue, betrayed her species, and failed to stop the genocide. She looked at Kale, lying dazed next to her, coughing up dust. His mission achieved. The artifact and the evidence were destroyed. She looked at the kitteness warrior, which had turned its back, resigned to the coming slaughter, walking slowly toward its wounded companion. Jonah's last, desperate gamble had failed, not because of the enemy, but because of the enemy within. The rage at Kale, the desire for revenge against Torin, had overridden the tactical precision she needed. In trying to do too much, she had achieved nothing. She was broken, alone, defeated. But she still held one last piece of information: the specific neurofrequency the compact used to induce psychosis before sterilization. Jonah pushed herself up, leaving Kale behind. She crawled to the abandoned telemetry unit, now just twisted scrap metal, and ripped out a piece of sharp fractured vibro steel. She reached up to her helmet's damaged auxiliary control panel, using the sharp edge of the steel to open a sealed access port that contained the suit's internal comms dampener. This was not the comms array. This was the physical interface for her own neural filter. She jammed the sharp steel shard into the interface, forcing a connection between the compact's neurofrequency data she had glimpsed and the suit's dampening system. The pain was immediate, a spike of white-hot agony that ripped through her optic nerves. Her suit screamed electrically, but the filters engaged. Jonah was now shielded from the compact's final psychological weapon. She looked out at the jungle, waiting for the sky to burn. Standing alone in a clearing full of the dead and the doomed, she had failed to save the world, but in a final defiant act of human integrity, Jonah Phelan had saved her own mind. The orbital strike commenced with a silent, blinding flash in the atmosphere, and Jonah Phelan, the demoted technician who had chosen bone over steel, knew that whatever came next, she would face it awake. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. The silence that followed the failed core detonation was the sound of complete, final vacuum. It pressed on Jonah's ears, forcing the residual hum of the chitinous frequency deep inside her skull to the forefront. The white glare of the mantis core had receded, leaving the clearing bathed in the sickly shifting green light of her ruined night vision filter, overlaid with erratic spikes of static caused by the charged vibro-steel shard jammed into her neural interface. The pain from that shard was no longer a spike. It was a constant throbbing current flowing from the base of her skull and down her spine. It was the price of clarity. She had saved her consciousness from the compact's neurofrequency weapon, but she had traded sanity for ceaseless, blinding agony. 1 minute and 15 seconds until the kinetic bombardment. Jonah pushed herself onto her elbows, the mud cold and viscous against the torn synthetic armor of her suit. The chitinous warrior was gone. It had retreated, carrying its wounded, into the steaming jungle foliage. The trust, the fleeting, desperate alliance was over. The creature had chosen the dignity of silent resistance over the futility of human collaboration. Jonah crawled toward the remains of her last confrontation. Lieutenant Kyle. He lay near the sealed ramp of the Relith, still conscious, but utterly undone by the neurofrequency weapon. He hadn't been killed by the EMP, he had been struck by the primary psychological attack that preceded the bombardment. Kale was twitching, small, rapid, uncontrolled movements running across his body like electrical currents. He wasn't screaming. Worse, he was laughing. A high, wet sound, devoid of humor, a mechanical cackle that scraped against Jonah's shielded nerves. He stared straight into the sky, his eyes wide and unblinking, reflecting the faint red glow of the orbital fleet above. "We won, Phelan," Kale giggled, the sound catching on his breath. "The bonus. The triple bonus. They're all burning. All of them. Beautiful. So much efficiency. So clean." Jonah stared at the pilot, witnessing the full, devastating purpose of Torin's war. They didn't just want the chitinous dead. They wanted their final moments to be spent in a state of terror and chaos, confirming the compact's absolute psychological dominance. Kale was the living proof of that horror, a compact officer driven permanently mad by his own side's weapon. The guilt, thick and acidic, rose in Jonah's throat. She had allowed this. Her clumsy attempt at an EMP had merely cleared the localized interference, giving the fleet a cleaner path for the neurofrequency deployment. She had secured nothing, saved nothing, and destroyed the evidence of the genocide simultaneously. She stared at the wrecked communions unit lying in the mud, separated from the femur shard. The shard itself was nowhere to be seen, likely buried deeper in the viscous soil by the mantis core shockwave. Jonah Phelan, demoted technician, ultimate failure. She had chosen the casualty over the compact, only to lose both the casualty, Kale's sanity, and the compact's future, the bone. Helios had taught her the cost of rigid adherence to doctrine. Kalen Prime had taught her the price of emotional resistance against a tactical reality she was too broken to manage. The greater good. She had scoffed at the term, realizing it was a mask for profit. But what was she fighting for now? She looked at the empty burning sky, the orbital timer flashing 0040 seconds. 40 seconds until the final sterilizing plasma strike arrived. She felt a profound wave of exhaustion wash over her, heavier than the mantis wreckage. She was dying, crippled, alone, trapped with a laughing madman and the knowledge of a cosmic crime. Why did I jam the filter? She closed her eyes, the rhythmic throbbing in her neck almost drowning out the sound of Kale's manic laughter. She had shielded her mind only to witness the full scope of her failure, forcing herself to be a conscious witness to the end of the world. She realized the truth of her self-betrayal. She hadn't sought to save the chitinous. She had sought revenge against Toran, using the chitinous as a tool. Her rage at Kale had caused the catastrophic failure of the amplifier. She was still the same arrogant, driven tactical lead who caused the Helios disaster, simply operating under a different flag of self-justification. It's time to stop. The thought was a deep, welcome darkness. It would be easy. Remove the vibro-steel shard, let the neurofrequency rush in, and succumb to the inevitable chaos. Death would be fast if not clean once the plasma hit. She reached up with a shaking, injured hand toward the jagged metal in her neck. "No," Jonah whispered, the sound raw and torn. She pulled her hand back, curling her fingers into the mud. "I am a witness." If nothing else, she would face the fire awake. It wasn't heroism. It was obstinance. It was the decision of a woman who refused to let the bastard that broke her dictate her final thoughts. The orbital countdown hit 15 seconds. The sky above Kalen Prime fractured with streaks of intense light, the plasma kinetic rods accelerating toward impact. Jonah's eyes fixed back on Kale, still cackling, and then she saw it. Not on Kale, but on the ground where the struggle had taken place. The ruined communions unit. Kale's clean, high-grade compact comms unit. It was crushed, half-submerged in mud and hydraulic fluid, utterly useless as a transmitter. But when Kale tackled her, and the bone shard slammed into the earth, it had momentarily driven the charcoal black femur through the dense polymer casing of the comms unit's internal memory drive before bouncing out and sinking into the mud nearby. The bone was gone, but the impression remained. The physical contact between the impossibly dense artifact and the compact memory matrix, even for a millisecond, might have physically imprinted the raw frequency data onto the crystalline storage chip, bypassing the need for a scanner or successful wireless transmission. The density itself might have been the data transfer mechanism, a salvage technician's epiphany. The logic was tenuous, desperate, and relied on a material science that defied all known physics, but it was something. 3 seconds. 2. 1. The first orbital plasma strike hit the atmosphere miles away, generating an unseen electromagnetic wave that raced toward the clearing. Jonah lunged toward the crushed comms unit, ignoring the agonizing scream of the vibrosteel in her neural filter. She tore the unit from the mud, flipping it over. The memory port, designed to withstand massive kinetic stress, was shattered, the chip visible beneath the twisted metal housing. She needed to access that chip, to download the impression, and she needed a power source strong enough to run the data compression protocol before the second. Massive plasma strikes sterilized the ground, vaporizing everything. The plasma rod struck the far horizon with a sound that was less an explosion and more a violent tear in the atmosphere, washing the clearing in a sudden, intense orange light that momentarily blinded Jonah's damaged vision. The ground shuddered. Jonah knew there was only one power source nearby with enough raw energy capacity to force a high-speed data compression: Kale's combat armor. Kale, still laughing hysterically, was paralyzed by the neurofrequency. Jonah crawled toward him, her suit systems screaming warnings about the unstable atmosphere and the proximity to the impending second strike. She reached the pilot and found the primary power coupler on his spine, designed to detach only under strict surgical conditions. Jonah ripped the comms unit cable free and, using the fractured shard of vibro steel from her neck as a makeshift tool, stabbed the cable deep into Kale's primary armor port. Kale's laughter immediately turned into a guttural moan of pain as the foreign connection overloaded his chassis. His armor system flashed red, transferring massive raw energy into the fragile, ruined comms unit in Jonah's hand. Data access attempt. Jonah stared at the fragmented screen of the comms unit. It flickered violently, showing only a raw energy input reading. No data, no frequency. Then, a single flickering line of text appeared, glowing sickly green on the broken display. Memory integrity, 0.000001%. It wasn't a complete transfer. It was a fragment, a ghost of the data. Jonah slammed the button on the unit, the emergency burst sequence. It had almost no chance of working, but it was the only command she had left. The comms unit screamed electrically, burning white-hot in her hand, overloading on Kyle's raw power. A split second later, the second plasma strike hit Kalen Prime, closer this time. The clearing was instantly engulfed in a blinding white-orange glare, the sound of atmospheric detonation tearing through the air, deafening Jonah even through her damaged seals. The light was overwhelming, but in that moment of absolute thermal shock, Jonah saw something moving at the very edge of the jungle line. Not the chitinous warrior, which was far too massive, but a figure. Human. Moving low and fast, covered in camouflage gear, sliding silently through the blinding light of the orbital destruction. The figure was carrying a specialized military-grade recovery kit, moving directly toward the immobilized and exposed Lieutenant Kale. It wasn't a rescue operation. It was a cleanup. The figure was from the Compact, likely a Black Ops asset sent by Toran to retrieve any remaining high-value intelligence or eliminate witnesses. Jonah stared at the new arrival, whose face was completely obscured by a reflective visor. In the instant before the light faded, the figure raised a compact suppressed weapon, aiming not at Jonah, but at the sputtering power coupler on Kale's back. If that figure severed the power, the unit would die, and Jonah would lose even the fractional data burst she had managed to initiate. If she moved, she would expose herself entirely. Jonah realized with a cold, terrifying certainty that she was not trapped in a war zone, but in a carefully orchestrated trap. The orbital strike was Toran's way of ensuring the evidence died with the victims, and this new arrival was the final lock on the vault. The orbital bombardment was no longer a threat. It was a physical reality. The second plasma strike had shredded the atmosphere, the shockwave hitting Jonah like a physical blow, driving the vibro-steel shard deeper into her neural interface. The sudden, overwhelming light faded quickly, replaced by the toxic, low-resolution green of her emergency optics, and the sickening wet sound of Lieutenant Kale's continuous, hysterical laughter. Jonah's chest seized, the pain in her ribs merging with the agony in her neck. Her focus narrowed entirely to the black-clad figure, the cleanup asset, moving with silent, precise efficiency toward Kyle. The figure was armed with a silenced coil gun, its movement predatory and non-standard, not standard military. This was Toran's personal solution. The asset, recognizing the overloaded power coupler on Kale's back, was moving to neutralize the rogue energy source, the last connection Jonah had to the fractured data. Memory integrity, 0.001%. The infinitesimal fragment of the chitinous frequency, imprinted onto the crystalline matrix of the comms unit, was Jonah's only weapon. She had seconds before the asset destroyed the power source, erasing the evidence. Jonah did not move to fight the asset. She couldn't. She was functionally crippled, and the asset was fresh, fast, and armed. Instead, she used her failure, the massive uncontrolled power transfer, as her sole leverage. She crawled back toward Cale, ignoring his manic cackle and the frantic warning lights flashing on her HUD. She reached the power coupler on his spine and, with a final desperate twist of her broken wrist, forced the vibrosteel shard deeper into the port, twisting the internal contacts and maximizing the energy flow. Cale's laughter instantly spiked into a raw, electric shriek. His armor system, already bleeding power, began to smoke violently. Jonah hadn't killed the pilot, but she had forced his power output to an unsustainable maximum, a desperate gambit to buy time for the emergency burst sequence to complete. The asset stopped, momentarily confused by the sudden, uncontrolled escalation of energy. This was not the clean kill and retrieve scenario they had trained for. Jonah screamed an internal command, overriding the comms unit's safety protocols. Force transmit. Maximum compression. Destination. Fleet Global Intercept. She was sending the fractional data point, the ghost of the chitinous frequency, not to the Relith, but to the entire compact fleet. It was a chaotic encrypted microburst, designed to look like a system anomaly. The asset recovered instantly, raising the coil gun. It understood the threat, an uncontrolled high-energy transmission leaving the zone. It fired, not at Jonah, but at the spine coupler on Kyle, aiming to sever the power line. But Jonah had predicted the reaction. She knew the asset was aiming for an efficient, silent neutralization of the power source. She twisted Cale's body slightly, leveraging the weight of the massive comms unit still clenched in her hand. The coil gun round struck Cale's chassis, not on the coupler, but inches lower, impacting the auxiliary stabilization joint of his leg strut. The dense, kinetic round severed the connection entirely. The flow of power instantly stopped. The ruined comms unit in Jonah's hand went dark, falling silent. The emergency burst sequence had failed to complete. Transmission status: 3% complete. Jonah's vision swam. She had sacrificed the man's physical integrity, endured agonizing pain, and risked everything to send a fragment of data, and she had failed. Toran had won. The evidence was destroyed. The asset stood over her, coil gun reloaded, waiting for the final execution order. The asset spoke for the first time, its voice heavily modulated, genderless, laced with the cold professionalism of a perfected killer. Lieutenant Phelan, stand down. This is authorized elimination protocol. You have failed to comply with P1 disposition. Jonah looked up at the figure. The moment of despair had passed. What replaced it was a cold, pure calculation. She had already accepted death, and the knowledge that she carried the Compact's ultimate secret, the neurofrequency weapon, was now her only currency. She had no weapon, no physical advantage. She had only her failure and the asset's rigid adherence to protocol. You won't get the bone, Jonah transmitted, her voice weak but steady, ignoring the command to stand down. It's buried. The only remaining intelligence is the neurofrequency countermeasure data, and it's in my head. The asset paused. It lowered the coil gun slightly, tilting its head. Your suit's internal telemetry reports an active neural stabilizer, an unauthorized modification. You are shielded from the frequency weapon, but that data cannot be accessed physically without fatal cranial trauma. Try it, Jonah challenged, forcing a rasping breath past her broken ribs. You can kill me clean, and the countermeasure dies with me. Or you can retrieve the data, expose Toran's side project, and violate your entire operational mandate. Which is the greater service to the Compact asset? Jonah was playing a game of systemic loyalty, targeting the asset's programming. The asset was not a mercenary like Cale. It was a soldier designed for optimal efficiency. If the data, proof of Compact genocide, was more valuable than her death, it would hesitate. Toran ordered the sterilization of all witnesses, Lieutenant, the asset stated, its voice devoid of emotion. That includes anyone aware of the countermeasure frequency. Then you lose the countermeasure, Jonah insisted. And every future conflict with a dense bone species becomes a slaughter. You want to destroy the evidence of the Compact's war crime or secure the key to future victories? The asset stood motionless for 5 full seconds, analyzing the paradox. Jonah realized that its hesitation was a victory. The asset's mission, efficiency, was conflicting with Torin's command, erasure. Just then, a voice, sharp and digital, cut through the residual static on the open fleet frequency. It was Torin, the Vice Admiral, his voice tight with fury, overriding all local channels. Asset, eliminate Phelan immediately. The orbital bombardment is proceeding with the final sterilization pulse. You are now designated non-essential. All personnel are to evacuate immediately or be considered contaminated. Torin wasn't just ordering her death. He was cutting off the asset's lifeline, sacrificing his own cleaner to ensure silence. The asset's visor flickered, recognizing the betrayal. Torin had deemed its data retrieval function less important than preserving his own political future. The asset raised the coil gun again, but its aim was shaky, the smooth certainty gone. The countermeasure dies with me, asset, Jonah whispered. But my final fragmented burst transmission, that 7.3%, it went out. It's sitting in the Compact's raw data pipeline right now, flagged as a massive frequency anomaly. It won't expose Torin, but it will raise questions. If you kill me now, the only answer the fleet gets is silence. If you bring me back alive as a contaminated prisoner, you force the inquiry. Jonah was offering the asset an opportunity for self-preservation through insubordination, appealing to the cold, professional ego of the covert operative. Bring back the witness. Force the system to acknowledge the failure. The asset dropped its aim. It made a decision of pure, terrible pragmatism. It would not kill Jonah. It would use her. The asset reached out a hand, grabbing the fractured smoking comms unit from the mud where Jonah had dropped it. Then, with terrifying speed, it performed a complex technical maneuver Jonah hadn't conceived of. The asset didn't try to access the damaged chip. Instead, it jammed the ruined unit's fractured data port into its own armor's main telemetry uplink, using its superior chassis processing power to instantly compress and retransmit the fragment of data Jonah had failed to send. Transmission status, 7.3% complete. Transmitting now. The asset had used Torin's betrayal to justify an act of high treason. It secured the fragmented evidence, ensuring the anomaly would not be missed by the Compact's centralized intelligence. It had guaranteed an inquiry. Then, without looking at Jonah, the asset turned and fired the coil gun, a single, clean shot, at the immobilized Lieutenant Kale. Kale's body jumped, and his manic laughter instantly ceased. He was dead, silenced by the asset to prevent his testimony from contaminating the highly efficient narrative that was about to unfold. Kyle is neutralized, the asset stated to Jonah, its voice crisp. The integrity of the Compact is paramount. Your data fragment has been secured. You are now the only remaining witness. The asset reached down, grabbed Jonah by her damaged shoulder. The pain was instant and blinding, and began dragging her toward the jungle line, moving away from the doomed extraction zone. We are not going to the Relith, Jonah managed to gasp, the movement tearing through her ribs. Negative. The Relith is a liability, the asset stated. I have established a private, unscheduled extraction vector. Your survival is now mandated by the Asset Integrity Protocol. You are Priority 1 cargo. Jonah Phelan, the demoted salvage technician, had just become the most valuable and most dangerous piece of evidence in the entire war. She had leveraged her crippling failure, the fractional data burst and the proximity to Kale, to force the asset into betraying Torin. But the cost was immediate and palpable. As they moved through the wreckage, Jonah felt the constant burning pressure of the vibro-steel shard in her neck. The consciousness it had bought her was now a cage of endless pain. She would never feel relief from the trauma. She would only feel the clarity of what she had allowed to happen. The asset dragged her quickly into the dense foliage, The sounds of the orbital strike's final pulse muffled by the thick steaming air. The jungle was absolute darkness now, lit only by the red glow of the asset's stealth systems. Jonah's body was broken. Her ribs were shattered. Her neural filter was permanently damaged. She had condemned Kale to death, betrayed Toran, and helped an agent of the Compact commit high treason. She had saved the men on the Relith, but she had ensured the entire fleet would now turn its analytical gaze toward her. She looked down at her hands, smeared with Kale's blood and the black, viscous mud of Kalen Prime. She had traded her purity for a sliver of truth. She was not a hero. She was a necessary pollutant, a contaminated sample that the Compact could no longer discard. A low, resonant sound cut through the forest, the Kittinus warrior, observing their retreat. It wasn't a threat, but a confirmation. The enemy is saved, but the humans remain. The asset stopped, looking back at the doomed clearing. Your survival is now a logistical problem, Lieutenant. You will be debriefed on a remote station. If you attempt escape, you will be neutralized efficiently. Jonah merely nodded, too exhausted to argue. Her struggle to prove her tactical worth was over. Her war against the schematic was resolved with a horrifying compromise. She had won the moral argument by losing the fight, and she had forced the system to acknowledge her existence. The asset began moving again, pulling Jonah deeper into the alien night. She accepted her new reality. She had traded her integrity for survival, and the cold, dense bone of the Kittinus had imprinted a permanent mark on her consciousness. The asset was right. Jonah Phelan was priority 1 cargo now, but she was cargo carrying the knowledge of a crime, and she knew the true battle was yet to begin. "What is your designation, asset?" Jonah asked, her voice flat. "I am simply the extraction variable," the asset replied, never breaking stride. "And you, Lieutenant, are the variable that survives." The journey was no longer marked by the steaming iron-thick air of Kalen Prime, but by the clean, sterile smell of medical sealant and the low, constant hum of stealth systems. Jonah Phelan spent 3 standard rotations submerged in nutrient gel within the asset's covert transport, a pressurized coffin stripped of all human comfort. The exterior world was gone, replaced by the low thrum of drives pushing them toward a nameless remote observation post. Jonah was not being rescued, she was being quarantined. When the asset finally pulled her from the gel, her skin felt raw, and the repairs to her shattered ribs were basic, a rigid synthetic sheath designed for structural stability, not comfort. The asset worked on her body with cold, efficient hands, replacing the damaged armor panels, restoring minimal functionality. But the asset did not touch the neck. The vibro steel shard remained jammed into her neural interface. The sensor array confirms chronic, high-frequency neural pain, the asset stated, its modulated voice devoid of judgment. Permanent. "It remains," Jonah confirmed, the words hoarse. "Proof of the acquired intelligence," the asset concluded, its visor flickering momentarily as it secured the final armor plate. "You are functionally stable, Lieutenant Phelan, but perpetually compromised, unfit for command, perfectly suited for testimony." Jonah understood the cold calculus. The pain was her witness protection. It guaranteed she couldn't lie about the neurofrequency, and it guaranteed she would be perpetually disabled, unfit for any position of real power within the Compact. She had traded one cage for another. They arrived at the quarantine station, a cold, orbital spire named Veritas Null, a week later. The asset showed Jonah the data reports, displayed on a clean, ordered terminal screen in her containment cell. The 3% data fragment, the ghost of the Kittinus frequency, had been flagged as a severe systemic anomaly, forcing an internal audit that the Compact could not ignore without massive data corruption. Toran was temporarily relieved of command, pending investigation, a bureaucratic victory, achieved through high treason and desperate improvisation. "They will kill you after the debriefing," Jonah stated, looking at the asset, who stood impassive at the sealed door of her cell. "My efficiency rating is compromised. I am expendable," the asset confirmed without emotion. "But your survival is mandatory. until the data is fully reverse-engineered. The compact requires a scapegoat for the audit, Lieutenant. You are the contaminated evidence. I am merely the cleaner who secured the sample." Jonah looked away from the data screen. She was a tool, a necessary evil, locked in a sterile laboratory instead of a jungle grave. She had forced the compact to see its own monstrous reflection in the mirror of the Chitinous' defense. The cost had been everything she had left: her health, her career, her peace. But peace, she realized, was the luxury of the ignorant. The war on Kalen Prime was over. The planet was sterilized, its complex civilization wiped clean by the final plasma pulse. Dax and Nielsen were safe, evacuated by the crippled Relith, their recovery now a high-priority logistical nightmare for Command. The injustice of Toran's war, the genocide masked as defense, was temporarily halted, postponed by an inquiry designed to suppress rather than reveal. Jonah sat on the edge of the sterile medical cot, the silence of the orbital station absolute, broken only by the low hum of the diagnostic terminals. She looked at the vibrosteel shard reflecting the artificial white light of the cell. She was a ruin, a monument to arrogance. They had laughed at the Chitinous, dismissing their bone as primitive, believing their own technology to be the ultimate measure of strength. But the bone had endured the impact that her reinforced steel never could. It wasn't the density that mattered, Jonah finally understood. It was the intent, the decision to transform every atom of their being into a shield against extinction. The Chitinous had found salvation in their internal structure, in turning their deepest, strongest material into armor against the terror from the sky. They relied on bone. Jonah had relied on steel, and the steel had shattered instantly, leaving her only with the cold, internal bone of the truth. The failure at Helios had been paralysis, the inability to choose the immediate, human cost over the schematic. The forced victory on Kalen Prime was the opposite, the acceptance of necessary chaos, the decision to carry the perpetual, agonizing truth, the vibrosteel shard in her own neck, as her final, undeniable testimony. Jonah Phelan, the demoted technician, the contaminated witness, would spend the rest of her existence as the cold, hard, unmoving proof. She had not found redemption, only responsibility. She had not earned rest, only clarity. She did not regret the choice to prioritize life over logistics, even if it meant her survival was now a living, agonizing prison. The burden of that knowledge was her new, eternal duty. She finally allowed herself to touch the junction where the shard disappeared beneath the synthetic sheath of her skin, the source of the constant, high-frequency pain. She closed her eyes, feeling the vibration deep in her teeth, a residual echo of the planet she had failed to save. The war for the compact continued, but her personal war, the struggle against the schematics and the lies of the greater good, was over. She had lost the plasma conduit in the 5th millisecond of contact, but she had gained the truth. The silence was absolute. Jonah opened her hand, the tremor, permanent, and stared at the empty palm. She survived the contact, but the steel, the lie, shattered, leaving only the agonizing, necessary bone. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions, and share this episode with someone who still believes in science fiction.